Time to begin. We are in Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. Is the volume okay, folks in the back? Volume okay? Okay, good. When you're old and deaf and can't tell how loud you are and you're used to your wife doing this a lot, then you have to ask. Daniel chapter 8. It is our custom to begin with a prayer for those who are hurting and need our prayers. You have an announcement sheet. If you don't, there's one on the table back there in the back you can get. And so we read all those. We know you can read. Our heartfelt sympathy is expressed to Monica Gilvin in the passing of her mother, Judy Barnard, on Tuesday. Funeral service is private for the family only, so we will not be involved in that, but we will be involved in giving Monica hugs and prayers as we see her. Tommy Caudle had triple bypass surgery Friday, and he's out in a room now, and so that's a plus. He seems to be doing well. The doctors think he's doing better than he is, if that makes sense. He said, I'm not sure I should be out here, but they thought he could be out in the room, and so he is. Is the toy collection thing still out there? Toy collection box, new toys only for UK Children's Hospital, in honor of Ella Howard's 4th birthday, which is today, I think. John Moore continues to need your prayers. Emily Newell is trying to hang on, and they're trying to wait to take her baby August 8th. The delivery date is August 8th, and she's had a really hard time with this pregnancy, so keep her in your prayers. Natalie Sparks' test did come back positive for cancer, so they're going to take the rest of her thyroid out on September 4th. Gail Tipton is at home improving, and of course Jeff and Vernon and Gerald all continue to need our prayers. Who else do we need to add this morning? Anybody? Bypass surgery Tuesday. And his name is what? Larry Cross. Larry Cross. All righty. Friend of Rob's who is having bypass surgery Tuesday. 49. That's young to have bypass. Well, I guess any age is young to have bypass surgery. I went into a hospital room one time with this old guy named Junior Miller was having bypass surgery, and I was a young preacher, and I said, Junior, that's about routine now. And he said, not when they're doing it to you. So I've never said that again. I never have said that anymore. Well, we'll start with the prayer. Kenny, would you lead us, please? Amen. Well, Daniel chapter 8 is a fascinating chapter. We have been talking about some of these visions, and as I've studied this, I thought that if you don't come away from Daniel 8 more amazed about the ability of God than you were before, then you're unamazable. I know that's not a word, but this is fascinating stuff. Daniel has another vision, and this one is in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, which would be about 552 BC. But the interesting thing is the events that he's going to talk about took place in 537, 334, and if I'm correct on the third one, 165. And so we're talking about 15 years in the future, 200 years in the future, and 400 years in the future that Daniel is going to tell in great detail before all these years before it happens. Now, why would anybody need to know that far ahead of time? Well, remember, this is permanent record. This is inspired, and it was preserved. And so 400 years later, when you're going through the persecution, you're a Jew going through the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, you look back and say, oh, Daniel talked about that, and it's going to pass. It will. He will be defeated because Daniel said he would. And so it would give you strength in that sense, and it gives us strength in knowing that God is able to tell these things ahead of time. And so the vision begins in chapter 8 and the first 14 verses. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan. That's the winter capital of the Persian kings, in the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. And I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. So he's coming out of what? Has to be coming out of the east if he's going west, isn't he? Going westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. He did according to his will and became great. And the vision itself, Gabriel is going to explain who this is as we go along. But verse 5, as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west, across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. He's moving on, isn't he? He's really coming fast and furious. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore, the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. Now we'll stop there and talk a little bit. This is received by Daniel in the 3rd year. He is in Shushan, and I'll show you on a map as we go along. Shushan was the ancient capital of Elam, which became the capital city of the Medes and Persian Empire. Especially the kings had a winter home there and ruled from there. It is still a city in this day and time called Susa or Shushan. He was by the river Ulai, and he sees a 2-horned ram standing beside the river. The horns were high, with one higher than the other. Usually, you remember when we talked about the bear last week? One side was raised up, and he had those ribs in his mouth and all that. And we thought that probably meant that one part of the Mede, we're going to learn in a few minutes, he's talking about the Medes and Persians. And the Persians were probably bigger and more powerful than the Medes in that partnership. And so that's probably the horn that's bigger than the other, but came up second, came up afterward. He's pushing westward, northward, and southward. No beast can withstand him. None could deliver him from his hand. He did according to his own will until out of the west, coming east, coming right toward him, is a goat with a big horn between his eyes. One single horn. And he's coming across the surface of the earth, not touching the ground. He's moving swiftly, almost as if he were flying, almost as if he were floating across the surface of the earth. And he sees the goat. Daniel watches in verses 6 and 7. He watches the goat defeat the ram, and then the goat becomes strong. And he becomes strong, and eventually, though, the big horn, the large horn between his eyes is broken and replaced by four notable ones, four smaller ones that come up toward the four winds of heaven. And then verses 9 and following talks about out of all this comes a little horn, but he becomes powerful, and he's blasphemous and does things in the holy city, the glorious land, does things in the temple and those kinds of things that are blasphemous toward God. And we'll talk some more about him. He grew up to the. We'll start in verse 9, unless you have some questions. We'll get into a little more detail as we go along. But in verse 9. Out of one of them came the little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. You will remember reading in Matthew 25 and several places in Isaiah where this idea of host or stars or planets falling is usually leaders, rulers. In apocalyptic symbolic language, it's usually the host has to do with someone. You remember the king of Babylon in Isaiah was talked about as being the day star, or Lucifer, the bright star, and that he fell from heaven. It just means falling from their lofty position, from their power. And this little horn is powerful enough to pull down some powerful rulers and trample them. He even exalted himself as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. He cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and still prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgressions of desolation, and the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said 2,300 days, and the sanctuary will be cleansed. Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, was seeking the meaning of it, suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand this vision. And so this little horn is blasphemous. He goes into the Holy Land. He does all kinds of desecrating things to the temple and to those areas. He even exalts himself to the point of thinking he's a god. You remember that he's not the only one that's done that. Nebuchadnezzar did it. Belshazzar thought that he was untouchable, and others. And so this one is going to do the same. The only thing about this is hundreds of years in the future. Gabriel, in verses 15 and following, explains the vision. Daniel, in verse 15, says, when I was seeking the meaning, I heard a man's voice. Verse 17, he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep, and with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for the appointed time the end shall be. The ram which you saw, having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And so, this vision is pretty easy to understand, isn't it? Because Daniel tells you what it is. Gabriel tells Daniel, we're talking about the Medes and the Persians. Now, the Medes don't take over. You remember seeing in an earlier chapter where the Medes came, and the night of the drunken feast of Belshazzar, and the handwriting on the wall, and they came in and took over. We're back now to when Belshazzar is still ruling. And so it's going to be another 15 years or so, I think about 537 maybe, when that happened. And so it's going to be another 15 years or so in the future that the Medes and Persians take over. Then we have a one-horned goat, and there's little doubt about who that's talking about, probably Alexander the Great. Alexander, of course, was he was one who spread the Greek influence, the Greek Empire, all over the area. And again, we'll see a map as we go along. But he was the kingdom of Greece was the Grecian Empire took over the whole world, and or not the whole world, but a big part, and influenced them even down into the days of Jesus after the Romans had been in rule. The Greeks, they were still speaking Greek. They were still influenced heavily by them. And Alexander the Great was their golden child. He was that large horn. He defeated the Persians in 3 decisive battles. He was 33 when he died, and then 4 generals of his, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus, all took over these various parts of his kingdom, and it was from the Syrian part of that kingdom that Antiochus Epiphanes arose. And so Alexander was ferocious. He's that goat with that one horn, and nobody could withstand him. He comes crashing onto the scene and just conquers one after another. He had one 10-year-long campaign in which he never let his soldiers go home for 10 years solid. And he did things that a lot of soldiers, a lot of generals or leaders had never done. He crossed the desert from Jerusalem over to the east rather than going north and coming back down. And all of those things that nobody else had ever tried that, or the ones who did try it lost a lot of soldiers and men. And so Daniel is seeing in some pretty vivid detail the future kingdoms. Now, do you know why we call Daniel the prophet of world history? Well, obviously, that's what he talks about. And you may say, well, in Bible class, what in the world does world history have to do with Bible class? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because this is going to affect those Jews in the first, near the end of the Old Testament period, before the coming of Christ. They're going to go through some persecution. They're going to know by reading this that what to expect. The broken horn and the 4 horns, as I said, is where Alexander dies. And then the little horn that becomes so great and so blasphemous. Sometime later, verse 23, and the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall rise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart, He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, God himself. But he shall be broken without human means. And so most or many scholars believe that that's talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, and I have a sheet on him someplace. He ruled from 175 to 164. His surname was Epiphanes, which means God is manifest, but he was called by his enemies Epimanes, which means madman. He was cruel, he was vicious. He went to Egypt and was defeated, and on his way back he stopped in Jerusalem and made laws against using the law of Moses. He passed laws against meeting on the Sabbath, and he put pork, swine flesh on the altar in the temple. He instructed the soldiers to commit all sorts of sexual immorality in the temple itself. Anything that would offend a Jew, he did it. And of course, Daniel said, get ready for this. Daniel was talking about that. Of course, if you've ever read the apocryphal books of the Maccabees, you will know that it was a rebellion against Antiochus Epiphanes that caused, that finally stopped him, a rebellion by Judas, led by Judas Maccabeus, that gained momentum, and the Jews even now celebrate Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights, as around December 25th when they were delivered from Antiochus Epiphanes, from his rules and his laws, and they still celebrate that. And so he was one of the cruelest leaders. He was enterprising and ambitious, but he had a tendency to cruelty that bordered on madness. His primary aim was to unify the empire by spreading Greek civilization and culture, brought him into direct conflict with the Jews, and resulted in open rebellion in 167 BC. So you're talking about 400 years in the future that this little horn becomes great. That is, you see Elam and Madai or Medes. That's the Medes and the Persians' original territory. That's about what their empire looked like. And then you notice the Babylonian Empire, which was the original, where Daniel was originally taken. It reaches almost to Turkey, in the western part of Iran, over into Egypt, almost down to modern-day Saudi Arabia. But then you have the Persian Empire, wasn't quite... we're a little bit bigger than that, and there's Sushan or Susa in white, surrounded by red, and that's where Daniel was when he saw this vision. And then the Greek Empire, notice how much bigger it is. It goes all the way over to India, all the way over through into Greece and down into Egypt. That's Alexander the Great's territory. And so Daniel foretells all of that. In chapter 8 and verse 27, the effects of Daniel from the effects of this vision on Daniel, I think we ended in verse 25, start verse 26. The vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. And so we have this fascinating vision, and it is a detailed account of future world history. There is some question about who the little horn is. It really fits Antiochus Epiphanes very well. And I'm pretty much convinced that that's who it was. There's no doubt about who the others are, because he tells us the Medes and Persians and the Greeks. Gabriel shows up a time or two in Daniel's visions and explains things. He's going to do that again in chapter 9. But this vision is probably the easiest of the four to understand because the identity of the ram and the goat are given. History confirms what's described in this vision. You can go to secular history and learn these things. And the purpose of it, of course, is for the persecution, to prepare the people for the persecution. Now, what stands out to you about the accuracy of this vision? What pops in your mind when you read something like this and you know it's not going to happen for 400 years in the future? What does that cause you to think about Daniel, about God, about prophecy? You talk. I know you can. What's the first thing that you think of? Doug? Yeah. Yeah, that's it. It just drives home this idea of how awesome God is. And does it help you with if you ever had questions about the inspiration of the Bible and about the accuracy of prophecy? And here's the question that came to my mind when, and Scott, some of you scholars may be able to answer this. The question that came to my mind when I was studying this is, 100 years, or ever how many hundred years later, when the Medes and Persians and the Greeks and Antiochus were taking over, were they aware of this prophecy? Did they know that they had already been named in these things? Probably not. They probably did not know that God knew this was going to happen years ago. And God knew the outcome. He knew it before it happened, and He knew what was going to happen. And He knew how it was going to end. I mean, so that kind of thing, Doug, it is exactly what you're saying. It made my God look a whole lot bigger every time I study these things. I know He's big, and I know He's accurate, and I know He's all knowing and all powerful and omnipresent. I know all that. But to read something like this just makes it that much better. Doug? Yeah. Yeah, all those New Testament passages about the end of the world and the second coming of Christ and the judgment, and we understand that people die, but I wonder if we understand that God knows when that's going to happen, when the end is going to happen. We've all seen people die. Nobody's seen the world end yet, but it will. If He can foretell this, then the judgment's coming. And the end is coming. Absolutely. What else?
I don't remember much about the world history classes, but I do remember that the Medes and Persians were made known very much in those classes.
Yeah.
And it all relates back.
It does. It does. Now, there is a school of thought. Scott, I got you. I'll get you in just a second. There's a school of thought that we should never read anything but the Bible. And I believe that should be our primary thing. But you can't really understand this to the degree that maybe you should without reading secular history, can you? Because this talks about secular history. And so a minor course in world history wouldn't hurt you. to know about this. Scott, go ahead. Yeah. Absolutely. If you didn't hear Scott, he said about the fullness of time when the transgressions were complete. Galatians 4 and verse 4 says Jesus came in the fullness of time, at the exact right time. And so when the Jews had reached a certain level of transgression, when they rebel and so on, God would always, allow them to be oppressed, allow them to be taken into captivity. And then when the time was exactly right, he brought the Savior to usher in the new age. And so the Christian age. And so all of this is on God's time, on his plan. And he knows when it's going to happen, and he knows how to react accordingly, and he knows what's going to happen. And again, it just really drives home how powerful he is. But I was thinking of something when Scott said, verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, the four kings that came up, in the latter time of their kingdom, the four generals that took over after Alexander the Great died, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall rise. Transgressors reaching their fullness, some of the commentators think that's talking about the Jews reaching a level of disobedience and rebellion again. And some of them think that. And so it could be that God finally says, it's exactly right now to bring the Savior into the world. If you've ever read that old church history book, Maddox, written by Maddox, The Eternal Kingdom, he talks in there about what was going on in the Roman Empire when Christ came. And the author of that particular history book is convinced that God sent Christ at the exact time when the world needed to be called into check. when sinfulness and things were just out of control. Abortion was the regular practice of most physicians. Abandoned babies were commonplace. Homosexuality was rampant. All kinds of sinful activity and just blasphemous things were going on. And then right in the middle of all that, a baby is born in Bethlehem, who grows up to spread the gospel and to be the gospel, to be the good news. And so God knows exactly when these things are going to happen. I try not to speculate too much. I'm a little bit scared of opinions and speculation, but I can't help but to see it's a time in the future of the United States when we've gotten to the point that he says, okay, enough's enough. It's time to change. And I don't know how he's going to do it. Is he going to end it? Is he going to hand it over to some other nation? I remember we talked several times in this class about Isaiah's prophecy, and it's very vivid. It sticks in my mind, of dust on the balance. A nation is like dust on a scale, and God can blow it off and put another one on anytime he wants to. And you don't believe that? Look at our lesson. Look at Alexander the Great. He didn't know he was going to die when he was 33. He thought he was going to keep conquering. He finally had to quit after that 10-year excursion and let his soldiers go home to their wives for a while. And then he didn't live much longer after that when they came back. But he had planned on starting all over again and just continuing these military conquests. Didn't work out for him. And then his nation, all that he'd spent his life conquering, was divided into four parts and then eventually taken over by the Romans. And so one nation replaces another. And it's history, it's commonplace. But God knows about all these things. He knows when they're going to happen. He knows how they're going to come about. And when you read this vision that to prepare people for the time of the end and a latter time of indignation, Daniel talks about the persecution that would come on Israel toward the end of the Old Testament period. the commentator Young says that's what this is talking about. And of course it is if it's Antiochus Epiphanes, because he was in the 171 to 165. Now, the number of days in Daniel 8 and verse 26, the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Seal up the vision, for it... no, I looked at the wrong one. Hang on. Yeah, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. If it's literal number of days, it's almost 400 years later, so that is many days into the future. And the number of days of the sacrifices will cease, and the temple desolated in this verse 23 through 26 talks about when the sacrifices stop and all that, and he rises up against the prince of princes, but he won't last. He'll be destroyed without human means. Antiochus Epiphanes, the abomination of his rule was about 6 years, 171 to 165. So it may very well be talking about him, and at the end of his rule, overthrown by God Himself. And so we will we'll fill in our handout as we go, and maybe help you understand some of these things. But it's amazing to me that God could tell all of this in detail. Shouldn't be, because He's an amazing God. But Daniel, you think about Daniel. Daniel would have been insignificant to us, perhaps, when he was first taken into Babylonian captivity. He was about 15, but now he's an 80-some-year-old man who is very wise, and he sees this vision, and he's been able to interpret vision, so you don't question that part. So Daniel 8, question number 1, Daniel relates a vision of a ram and a goat. It was received by Daniel in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel was in Shushan, the province of Elam, near the river Ulai, which is the winter capital of the Persian kings. He saw a two-horned ram, and then a one-horned male goat, and the goat defeated the ram. Verse number 6. Number 7, what happened to the large horn? It was broken, and 4 other horns took its place. Gabriel, a angelic being, a created being who is apparently a minister of God. We see him more than once in the Bible. Was assigned to explain the vision. He explained that the two-horned ram was the Medes and the Persians, and the one-horned goat was the Greece and Alexander the Great. And then he goes, I didn't have a question about Antiochus Epiphanes, but he goes into that little horn that exalted himself and blasphemed and all those things. The effect that it had on Daniel, he fainted and was sick for days. The purpose of the vision was to prepare people for what was to come, and to have a written record. And the remarkable accuracy of it tells us what? God did it. God gave him that vision. It wasn't just Daniel making up things. So let's talk a little bit. We've got a few minutes. Let's talk about how it would affect you. Daniel said it caused him to faint, and he was sick for days when he learned this, and he was given some comfort by being told it's going to be way in the future. It's not going to happen tomorrow. How would it affect you to know the future? I know you've never known it, so you don't know, but how do you think it would? You think about Hezekiah, who was sick and asked for more time, prayed for more time, and God gave him 15 years. If it were 15 years to the minute, what would those last few days be like? What would those last few days of oh, my time's almost up? It could be one of two things, couldn't it? It could be, finally going to get to go home. Or, I got to hurry up and get some things done. I got to get all this tied together. It would be one of those two things, wouldn't it? Are you glad you don't know the future? You think it's wise not to know? Well, God must have thought it was wise because He didn't give us that ability. He must have thought it was wise not to know. And I'll tell you something else that Jesus was able to do that I'm glad we can't do. See the hearts of men. I'm glad I can't see in people and know what they're thinking. Now, it manifests itself in words and actions, and you can tell sometimes what somebody's thinking, but it's a good thing not to be able to see those things. Okay, closing comments. This is a short chapter, so we're going to give you back some change today. But next week, chapter 9, the vision of the 70 weeks, you won't get back any time on that one. We'll fill the whole time up. Anything else?
I'm just thinking that if I knew that I had 2 more years on this earth, I would be trying to cram into those 2 years all the things I should have been doing all these past years.
What a honest and sobering thing, Norma Joe. Isn't it funny that if we knew we had 2 weeks or 2 years, we would be doing like we were supposed to have been doing for 40 years or 50 years. We'd be doing those things that we ought to be doing now. I was just working this morning after I finished the class and my lesson for this morning. Got those in my head. I was working on a lesson for the future called What Does an Evangelistic Christian Look Like? And you'll probably get that when I get back from polishing the pulpit. But one of the things that I came up with was there shouldn't be any difference between the look of an evangelistic Christian and a Christian. We all ought to be evangelistic. And I don't mean all going out knocking doors and giving a prepared speech of manipulative questions and getting somebody wet never to see them again. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about living evangelistically as you go through this life. Acts 8 and verse 4. They preached the word everywhere they went, or as they went. And that kind of thing. Casual, comfortable conversation, and bringing every conversation eventually back around to Jesus. How are you and the Lord doing? I don't know why we're not all doing that anyway, and I dare say, Norma Joe, that if we were to be told that we have 2 weeks or 2 years left, a bunch of us would probably be better evangelists. I suspect that. And you can take that cheerful news and be dismissed. Thank you for your attention.